Good evening. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to the Trey Olds Radio Show. I'm Trey Olds. Thank you for joining us this evening. Today, my special guest is special effects artist, Mr. Jeff Farley. Thank you, and join us in a minute. Okay, my first question to you is, how did you get started in the entertainment business? How did you begin your career?
Well, I started out pretty much like anybody else. I read Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine and comic books, and I became a huge fan of Ray Harryhausen. King Kong was probably the first genre film that I do recall seeing at probably about age 5. And this would have been in the late 1960s or kind of the mid 1960s. And but I also in the early 70s caught a film titled Equinox, which was released in the theaters by a gentleman by the name of Jack H. Harris, who had produced the original Blob. And it turned out that I had seen David Allen and Dennis Muren that morning on television with some of the puppets and scenes from the film. And I begged my parents to take me to see it, and we did. And later, a few years later, I found out that the film had been shot around the area that I lived in. So,
oh wow!
It turns out that all those guys were living in the area, and I found them in the phone book. I started calling them and bugging them. And this was really mainly due because it turns out that my stepmother had opened the door to me to meet Forrest J. Ackerman, who was the editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, and he lived nearby. It turns out that she had been in the house that Forrey was occupying, or the mansion, mainly because her friend's parents owned the house prior. And even though Forrey was not in town that day, we drove by. His assistant, Dennis Billows, buzzed us in. We went down, and the first person we ran into was an ex-boyfriend of my stepmother's who was working for Forrey. So, Forrey was in Europe at the time, but once he got back and heard about me, he called me up and said, "Hey, I hear your birthday's coming up. Would you like to come over?" I said, "Sure, of course." And I met John Landis there that day. He stopped by, and he told me all about American Werewolf in London and the transformation scenes that Rick Baker was going to do. And he was just on his way to go up to Oregon to shoot Animal House. But through that connection with Forrey, I started to, Forrey introduced me to Jim Danforth. And through Jim, I had met Dave Allen and Dennis Muren, other guys from Equinox, and it turned out that Jim only lived a few blocks away from my junior high school, so I started going over to his place. And I first went to David Allen's when he was starting the Primevals with Charlie Band, and got to see all the stuff, in progress. And, and long story short, thanks to that, thanks to knowing Forrey, he called me up one night and said, "Ray Harryhausen is coming over New Year's Eve, and I'd love for you to come over and meet him." And sure enough, I went over there, and Ray was amazing. It was such a wonderful experience to meet him and have him appraise the drawings that I had done and things. But there happened to be another guy there by the name of Douglas Barrett Jones, who is not the Doug Jones, from Shape of Water, but an effects guy who had been working for the Berman Studios and Dawn Post Studios, and it was through him that he hired me on my first job, which was a film called Kingdom of the Spiders, starring William Shatner. So from that point, my friends and I were just dremeling background spiders and just throwing in a box, and sort of the first thing that we were involved in. We never got paid. It wasn't really that big a deal. We were in junior high school. But from there, it really started me on my path to start to figure out, what to do, how to do it. my original plan was to do stop motion animation, which, because even though it wasn't, a lost art, I saw Dawn of the Dead in the theater, and that turned me on to makeup effects.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I then gravitated towards that. It just seems so much more immediate. And then from there, I went to places with James Cummins and Makeup Effects Lab and Lance Anderson on shows like Serpent and the Rainbow and Shocker. And I went over to John Beekler's. I was part of Empire Pictures for the last year, and John sent me to Italy on their final show over their arena. And then I came back, and it just kept kind of going and going and going. It seemed like such a better choice than taking over my dad's sheet metal business. Although financially it may not have been the best choice.
Yeah. What is the most difficult or challenging part in your career for you? What do you find is the most difficult or most challenging?
I'll tell you, and maybe others have said this before. I'll be honest with you, it's waiting for money. It's waiting for financing to come in.
I've gotten that a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I'm waiting for shows that I've been attached to for years to get going, and who knows if they'll ever find the money. But that's the funniest thing about this industry is the fact that there's a lot of money that goes through it, but everybody is always searching for money. And those who have it don't want to spend their own. That's the first rule of producing, is never spend your own money. So, I find that to be the most challenging and difficult part.
Yeah. That and finding another project or another job after another sometimes.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the jobs just pop up, though. I mean, I've been on films where either I've had multi-picture deals with them, or by the time you're just finishing something up, another show pops up immediately, or it's already going to be going by the time you're finishing up. So you can be lucky there, but there's also a lot of wait time in between. And something, maybe that's the second most difficult part.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you have any upcoming projects in special effects or anything? Do you have any upcoming projects you can share?
I do have one that I'm not at liberty to discuss because, as far as I know, again, I don't know if the show will actually get going or not. And it was a year ago that they first contacted me, but it would be a remake of a 1980s cult horror film, and the script was actually pretty good. It was a good updating. Nobody likes remakes or reboots these days, but it was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And I'd worked with a ton of the people who were involved in the original version, so it'd be an interesting way to continue that lineage. I can really hope that it does. I'm going to be running some trophies for a film festival coming up, and and you never know. You never know what's coming up. That's kind of it's the one thing about this interesting industry is that you just never know what you'll be doing.
Yeah, but it's good to stay busy because if you enjoy it, why. Keep going. Don't give up if you enjoy it.
Well, it's, sometimes it's not always about enjoying it, too. It's about you got to pay your bills, and sometimes at my age, you realize it's like, my goodness, it's like, I don't know if I'm qualified for much else at this point. I could go mow lawns or flip burgers or something probably, but I'll never become a CEO of a business and I sort of avoided the digital craze, even though I have some friends who went into it early and really did well. To me it was. I think it's a wonderful tool. I think, everything digital is just a wonderful tool, and it's a great way to blend, the ability to for us to create images that we've never been able to create before. But sometimes it's more used as a crutch, I feel.
Yeah. the internet is good in some ways and it could be bad in some ways.
Yeah, true. But that's just like everything else in life, and you got to take the bad times with the good. But somehow I think that on the good side, it's about connections.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I do my show. And my show streams on the internet. I've been doing my show for 6 years, and it streams all over. Thanks
That's
to the...
wonderful.
Thank you.
That's so great. Of course, absolutely.
My next question is, let's talk about one of my favorite projects you've done was the Puppet Master series and some other movies for Full Moon and Charles Band.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get involved with Full Moon Productions and Charles Band films?
Well, it actually starts back with my time with John Buechler. After I had finished over at Lance Anderson's on Serpent and the Rainbow, I was there for about 3 months. I'd been interviewing with John Buechler previously, and this is back during the days of Empire Pictures. Mm-hmm. And I had, of course, like everybody else, gone over and interviewed with John a number of times and never got a job. But he always said, if you have anything new, like everyone says, if you have something new, love to check it out. So luckily, I had new work, and I had actually been hired onto Cellar Dweller when it got started. It was a film that John had done the effects for and directed. John calls me and says, "I'm hiring you. I'm over the barrel." And then a day later, he calls me and says, "The budget got slashed and I can't bring you in." So that's when I went over to Makeup Effects Lab and then to Lance's. But by the time, like I said, I was finished with Lance's, there was a lot of work going on over at MMI, John's company, and they were doing a show called Prison. And they were also doing the Garbage Pail Kids movie at the same time for another company called Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And so because of so much work there, I got brought in. And within 3 weeks, I found myself in charge of another show that was being done by Empire called Deadly Weapon, which was directed by a guy named Michael Miner, who was one of the co-writers of RoboCop. Mm-hmm. And, but I was with John and MMI for about 8 months, and the final 3 months of that was spent over in Italy on a show called Arena that they had done, a big science fiction show with a lot of aliens, and it was a 3-month shoot over there in Italy. We were shooting at the old Dino De Laurentiis Studios, which was then christened Empire Studios, and it was a wonderful experience. But I came back, and MMI had been dissolved because Empire had their problems, and I went over the Blob, and then, just kind of, shifted back between Lance's and ADI with Tom Woodruff and Alec Gillis Jr. and stuff like that. But Alchemy Effects had got started. Mm-hmm. And so I went over there, did a few weeks with them on a show called Mandroid, and then by 1994, Charlie had agreed to finally get Primevals going, the David Allen film, the one that I had already previously seen stuff as a teenager, and my roommate was going to go to Romania to shoot the film, but he had been hired by Todd Masters to go on to Demon Knight. So I had kind of a choice of either going to Todd's on Demon Knight, which is actually only being shot a few blocks from where we lived, which would have been great. But since I'd known Dave since I was a teenager, and I'd always wanted to work on Primevals, of course, I gravitated to that and ended up 9 weeks in Romania on the show. But that was a one-time show. I went there, I did it. We finished as much as we could, and then we came back. But a few months later, this is actually a few years later, Mark Williams had been doing Charlie shows. He had Mark Rappaport doing things. He also had Mark Williams doing shows. Mark was handling a show called The Killer Eye, and he was also handling Blood Dolls.
Oh, yeah.
But unfortunately, Mark passed away. He had contracted cancer, and he passed away. leaving a void. And Chris Bergschneider had already been doing things with